Hey everyone, welcome to another Deck Tech. Today we're going to be deck teching Temur Rogues, taking a deep dive into this fun little deck that I've been playing for as long as I've been playing Temur in Modern, I'd say. Maybe a bit less. I first was introduced to Temur Rogues by reading an article of a brewer that I follow quite closely, Jordan Boisvert. He writes over at Modern Nexus. And I was in the Temur spirit, considering I'm a big Temur Delver player in Modern, and I saw this cool little Rogues deck, or at least I saw the first version of this cool Rogues deck back then. I think it was 2016 or 2017, and I kind of fell in love with it. It was a cool, neat little deck, not completely trash, not something that would lose altogether. It definitely had some competitive potential. And I started tweaking it. I started brewing with it myself, and I just really enjoyed it. And now that I'm back to Magic and back to Modern, I decided to dust off the old list, bring it up to speed with some new tools that have been added since its incarnation back in 2016, 2017. And I want to share the deck with you. I already have some gameplay footage posted on my channel, and I plan on posting a lot more. But I figured now is a good time to start going through the deck and analyzing the creatures, the spells, the lands, the sideboard, and different lines of play that you can get with them. So let's start. Let's go with the creatures. That's really the core of this deck. It's where you're going to start seeing the rogues and how they play into the main strategy, which is beat down your opponent with tiny little creatures and gain incremental advantage, draw cards, dig through your deck for answers or threats. Whatever you really want to do, you can do it with your tiny little creatures. So let's start off with Fairy Miscreant. So Fairy Miscreant, it's a 1/1 flyer for 1 blue. When it comes into the battlefield, it does nothing on its own. But the minute you have more than one on the battlefield, you get to draw a card. So if you cast your second Fairy Miscreant and it resolves, you draw a card. If you cast your third and you have at least one other on the battlefield, you draw another card. It's drawing a card and you get a threat at the same time. It's up in the air. Don't underestimate Fairy Miscreant because most of your opponents will. They'll leave it alone and they'll let you attack in with it because it's just a 1/1. And then all of a sudden, turn 2, you're casting Thieves' Fortune for 1, digging through the top 4 cards of your deck for any card and putting it into your hand for 1 blue. So, not completely harmless in this deck. You run 4 of them. I would say it's a relatively important part of the deck. You don't want to thin out your deck of creatures. Really need to attack in as much as possible. Combos well with Obsessive Skinner, which we'll cover soon. Obviously, because Obsessive Skinner can start buffing up your Fairy Miscreants, and all of a sudden they become major threats. Noble Hierarch as well with the Exalted trigger. Another great way to make your Fairy Miscreants more dangerous. So fun little card. Up next is Noble Hierarch. So Noble Hierarch, we use Noble Hierarch for ramp. It allows us to potentially cast turn to Magus of the Moon or Blood Moon, or just allows us to accelerate into threats. Makes all of our threats bigger if they're attacking in alone, especially with Looter il-kor. So if Looter il-kor is on the battlefield and you're attacking in with just him, he can't be blocked by anything, essentially, in Modern, unless there's an opposing Looter il-kor, which will never happen. Getting an Exalted trigger or 2 or 3 on a Looter il-kor is just awesome because you're getting in free damage, essentially, and you're able to, draw and discard a card at the same time because of Looter il-kor's ability. So, Noble Hierarch, I don't think I need to really explain much more about Noble Hierarch. It fits very well into this shell and is very much integral part of your game plan. Up next is Tarmogoyf. It's Tarmogoyf. If you've listened to any of my other decks, or if you've played Modern for any amount of time, then you know Tarmogoyf and you know why it would be in a deck like this. It's an efficient beater. We have plenty of spells that make Tarmogoyf huge. I think we touch on every card type except Planeswalker. So, yeah, Tarmogoyfs can get pretty big pretty quickly in this deck. So Tarmogoyf's pretty awesome. Up next is Looter il-kor. So, I mean, look at Looter il-kor, all right? The artwork is interesting. It's from, a bygone era of Magic. I think it looks cool. It's, 1 blue, 1 colorless, 1/1, has shadow, which is, relevant, probably the main reason why we're even playing it. So it can only be blocked, or it can only block creatures that have shadow. So you're never going to be chumping with it, because no one plays creatures with shadow in Modern. And you're always going to be attacking in with it basically every turn, unless your opponent takes care of it. So it's basically an auto turn, turn sideways and attack. Its looting ability is great. It's powerful. We don't need too many lands in this deck. So, mid to late game, you often are drawing into lands, and those are awesome targets to discard when you do draw an answer or a threat, because of Looter il-kor's ability. So, or just feeding your graveyard, I suppose, for making Tarmogoyf bigger. But that's really a secondary benefit. So, yeah, I mean, Looter il-kor, again, is a pretty important part of this deck. I don't play 4 of because we need to make room for other creatures. I mean, it's not necessarily your win condition. It's just part of the whole team, and that's really the theme in this deck, is that there's no major threat that you need to get onto the battlefield. All of them can be, all of the attacking creatures here can be relatively lethal if they're not taken care of. So yeah, Looter il-kor is one of them, and again, Exalted Trigger from Noble Hierarch, Obsessive Skinner boosting it up with 1/1+1/+1 counters. Yeah, it's a fun little card to play with, and it definitely throws your opponents into a loop. I mean, do they kill the Looter il-kor? Do they kill your Tarmogoyf? Do they kill your Fair Miscreant? They're not sure. Next up is Obsessive Skinner. There used to be a 1-of in the deck, but I think Obsessive Skinner definitely deserves at least a 2-of in the main board. Delirium is activated relatively quickly with us, as early as turn 2. So, as early as turn 2, you're essentially +2/+2ing a creature of your choice, because of the Delirium ability. And I've won games, and I think I posted a match where that alone, won me the game with a little Looter il-kor. So, Obsessive Skinner is really a powerful card. Not something you necessarily want to see in too many numbers in the game. Keep in mind you could always traverse for it if you need it to start boosting up your creatures. But I think a 2-of works great here. You're going to draw it in most games, and it just starts boosting up your team. And those boosts, they add up. I mean, on every of your opponent's turns, you're adding a +1/+1 counters. So, hey, try it out. You'll love it. Up next are our 2 1-ofs, at least in the main board. So, starting off with Magus of the Moon. So, obviously, we are a deck that is sculpted around being able to play Blood Moon or Blood Moon-like effects. Magus of the Moon, a 1-of in the main because we usually traverse for it, which I do often in games early on when I realize that Magus of the Moon is required to, shut down a greedy mana base. So we start off with a 1-of, and we have one more in the sideboard, plus a Blood Moon. So, I like Magus of the Moon. They can win games. You can win game 1s really, really quickly, because most opponents are not expecting Blood Moon-like effects game 1, I guess, unless they smell Ponza, which we are not playing. So, yeah, I mean, don't need to explain too much there. It's soft creature removal, but that's okay. Lastly, for our creatures is Huntmaster of the Fells. Again, a 1-of. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a finisher, but it often acts as a finisher. I often go for it when I have at least 1 or 2 Tarmogoyfs on the battlefield. I'll traverse for Huntmaster if I'm not drawing into it, because it can close games relatively quickly just by our ability to control its flips. which we can do again relatively easily in this deck. And oftentimes I find myself not even going in sideways with my Ravager of the Fells. I just, if there are creatures that can kill it, then I'm not going to bother attacking in with it. I'm just going to let it flip back and forth, and we gain value from those flips. So yeah, it's a one of. You definitely don't want more than one really in the main. You could always run another one in the sideboard if you feel you need it, but I think a one of in the 75 is sufficient, given that we have other threats that we can rely on. So that does it for our creatures. Definitely an interesting group of creatures to put into a deck, but hey, it's Temur Rogues. It is what it is. Let's move on to instants. Let's start with Lightning Bolt. You run 4. You always run 4. You remove it if you're not playing against a creature-heavy deck. End of story. I'm not going to spend too much time on Lightning Bolt. Up next is Mana Leak. So, Mana Leak, it depends on the type of gameplay or the type of player that you are, the type of pilot that you are. You don't need permission in the main, but I like having some permission in the main. It helps shore up some game ones against combo decks or decks with really big creatures really early on. It's the main reason I run 2 in the main and 1 more on the sideboard. So yeah, I guess it's a flex spot depending on how you like to play, but I think 2 in the main is required. Last but not least, for instance, one of the main reasons why you even want to play Temur Rogues is Thieves' Fortune. So for blue and 2 generic mana, you get to look at the top 4 cards of your library and put 1 of them into your hand, any one, and the other 3 go to the bottom of your library. Of course, you're going to be usually casting this for its Prowl cost, which is, instead of paying 3 mana, you're only paying 1, which is insane. Given the fact that you get to dig 4 cards deep. And I can't tell you the amount of games I've won, either, even if I'm just casting it for its full mana cost, but usually just for 1 blue, I need a Lightning Bolt, or I just need this one answer, and I attack in with a Fairy Miscreant, or Looter il-kor, or an Obsessive Skinner, and I run Thieves' Fortune, and I dig through 4 cards, and I get the Lightning Bolt. It's happened more than once. And I think I have a few matches where I show that. And sometimes not looking for Lightning Bolt, sometimes you're just looking for a threat or a traverse. A traverse is good enough because you could go search for a threat. It's a tribal instant, which means, it acts as an instant and a tribal in your graveyard, helping Delirium, helping Tarmogoyf. Oh my god, Thieves' Fortune is super fun. Super fun to play with. I've had many opponents, comment on Thieves' Fortune saying it's such a cool card. You'll love Thieves' Fortune. It's really great, and is only really workable in this kind of a shell. So, moving on to sorceries. These are pretty straightforward. 4 times Serum Visions. Card draw, filtering. There you go. Serum Visions is why you play it. Next up is Traverse. Traverse is actually really powerful in this deck. The main reason being we get to turn on Delirium relatively easily. And what we get to do is basically we get to run, different types of creatures as one-ofs that we can just, tutor for using Traverse. So it's kind of like a creature toolbox deck in a way. I've definitely moved away from the toolbox setup since 2017 when this was a lot more toolboxy. The sideboard was jam-packed of creatures as opposed to regular, non-creature spells. When we get to the sideboard, you'll see that there's still some remnants of that, but it's changed. But yeah, listen, Traverse is great if you have weird mana in your starting hand, but you want a Blood Moon on turn 2 or turn 3. Traverse will help you with that because you can just go get a basic that you need. It's really pivotal in this deck. I think without Traverse, I would have less reasons to play Temur Rogues. Traverse has definitely pushed it up a notch and made it more viable, I find, against the current meta. So that's it for sorceries. That was pretty quick. Let's move on to artifacts. There's only 4 of them, and they're all the same card, Mishra's Bauble. listen, we get to draw an extra card for 0 mana. We get to look at the top of our deck or our opponent's deck to get an idea of what's coming. And it helps feed Delirium and your Tarmogoyf. End of story. That's why it's there. Until Wizards bans it, I'll be playing it in this type of a deck. That's it. Case closed. And that's it for artifacts. Let's move on quickly to enchantments. Again, we only run 2 under the same one. Seal of Fire. More creature removal, obviously, here. And the fact that it's an enchantment, again, helps with Delirium, helps with Tarmogoyf. So that's why we're playing it. This is why I'm actually not running Tarfire, although you could. I mean, especially if you're going to remove the 2 mana leaks, you could go around Tarfire instead, and that'll help. But Seal of Fire helps because it's your enchantment, and again, it acts as another card type in your graveyard. And that's it for spells. Next up are lands. So we run 17 lands. You don't really want to run less than 17, and you definitely don't want to run more. I find for the curve, the curve is relatively low here. Apart from Huntmaster, most of our spells are 2 mana or less. Max of the Moon is 3. Thieves' Fortune is technically 3, but you're usually casting it for 1. So you don't need too many lands, but you do need enough lands to make sure you can keep up with your opponent. Because that's something, this deck... I'll get into it at the end when I give my final thoughts, but you definitely don't want to fall behind with Temur Rogues. So looking at the lands, we have your usual fetches that you see in these types of builds. We have 4 Misty Rainforests, we have 2 Wooded Foothills, and only 2 Scalding Tarns. Usually I run 4, but I needed space for more basics. We don't want the mana base to be too painful, and we do want the ability to really go get as many basics as we need with Traverse early on if we're in a jam. And plus, we're running Blood Moon effects, so we want easy access to our basics. So it's the main reason why I'm only running 2 Scalding Tarn. Next for the Shocklands, 2 Steam Vents, 1 Stomping Ground, 1 Breeding Pool. That's pretty standard. I run the same composition in my Temur Hooting Delver deck, so nothing much changes there. I think that's a safe and tested composition to use in this kind of a deck. So stick to that. And as for the basics, so 2 forests, 2 islands, and 1 mountain. Mountain, again, that's mostly there because we don't want to have a mana base that's too painful in Temur Rogues. It's a bit different in Temur Hooting Delver because we have a lot more... We have a bigger ability to kind of keep things at bay and control the tempo. This is a less tempo, this is more aggro. So in Temur Rogues, you're less waiting on your opponent, you're more like, just let's attack in. So this is why the mountain actually helps here. It's 1 less shock we would have to fetch for example, if we just need a red to cast Magus of the Moon on turn 2, for example. So yeah, that's really my thinking there, and it's worked well so far. And then 2 forests, 2 islands. It's really a split. It's up to you how you want to do that. I don't think you need 3 forests. I don't think you need 3 islands. So I think a 2-2 split is a proper medium. And that does it for the 60. That's the main board. Let's move on to the sideboard. So the version I'm currently playing of Temur Rogues does run Companion. Gigantha. Gigantha definitely does not make or break this deck. It worked without it. I've made it work recently without it. The fact is Gigantha is still available even with the Companion nerf, and it does provide us with an extra 5/5 threat mid to late game if our opponent has been doing a good job of killing off our creatures. It's really the main reason why it's there, because Temur Rogues does have an issue of catching up if it falls behind even a little bit. If our opponent just has all the answers to our creatures, then that's a problem. So an extra 5/5 body that we can get at all times is useful. And we will often have access to 3 to 5 mana mid to late game, so I think Gigantha can work here, but you really don't need to run him. to make this work if you really don't want to. If you feel like that spot would be better replaced with another creature, a big finisher that you can traverse for, that you could side in for certain matchups, that works just as well. So yeah, I mean, I just want to, if we're starting with the sideboard, Gigantha's in the sideboard, so let's just get the companion out of the way. I've made no cuts to this deck to make the companion requirements fit. They just fit naturally, so why not in this case? I mean, I guess that's a problem with companion, but that's a different discussion for a different video. So let's get on to the other sideboard cards. So I have one Blood Moon, as opposed to 2 to 3 as opposed to 1 to 2 Magicid Moons in the side. Mainly because I would like at least one Blood Moon-like effect that can't be removed with, 75% of the removal in Modern. That being damage-based removal or creature-specific removal. We can't tutor for it, but that's okay. Again, it's just really there as an extra insurance. We do run a second Magus of the Moon in the side to make, so that gives us 3 total Blood Moon-like effects in the 75. I think that's sufficient. Worst case, if one Magus gets shut down, you could traverse for a second. And worst case, if that one gets shut down, you might have potentially already found your Blood Moon just by drawing into it naturally or by using Thieves' Fortune, which I have done. Next up is Ceremonious Rejection. This is really meta-dependent. I'll bring it in against, Tron decks, Eldrazi decks, Hardened Scales decks. I'm just trying to think of all the decks that run a ton of colorless spells. But Ceremonious Rejection is a really nice and elegant way to just counter them for 1 mana. So it's relatively efficient if you think of it that way. So this is why I run 2 of. Again, if your meta is not heavy on those types of decks, then you could swap this for something else that would fit your meta a bit more. And again, I know I usually give a disclaimer when I'm going over the sideboard. Of course, sideboards, they change often. They change as the metas change, and they change depending on what your local meta is. So usually nothing in the sideboard is a must. You feel free to change them around as you see fit. But I just want to share with you what I've been running and what's been working for me. Up next, one of Cindervines. Mostly here for, again, destroying an artifact or an enchantment. It can work well against Storm decks, although it's not the main reason why I run it. But it's a bonus. And it does definitely shut down Storm decks if they can't remove it. So one Cindervines I think is sufficient. We have other ways of destroying or disrupting artifacts, which we'll get to next. So I think a 1 of is fine. Up next, Collector Oofy. Activated abilities of artifacts can be activated. So this pretty much shuts down Hardened Scales decks. It'll shut down essentially any deck that requires artifacts to cast or to produce mana or to do whatever. You could even bring it in against Erosa decks, although you're not targeting too much there. But yeah, I like Collector Oofy. You could bring it in to stop equipments from being used. There's a lot of angles of attack, and you can tutor for it with Traverse, bring up that whole toolbox mindset. So a 1 of is pretty useful. Up next, Engineered Explosives. I mean, listen, it's a catch-all if you are running against a tokens deck or a deck that just goes wide, or a deck that you're worried about running Chalice. Engineered Explosives just has many applications. It's definitely something. It's definitely a card I include in most decks, where I can cast it for 1, 2, or 3 different colors of mana. So, yeah, Engineering Explosives. No need to go too much more into it. Definitely a useful card. I want to have Grafdigger's Cage. We're not necessarily favored against graveyard decks. I am running only 1 of these. You might want to play around with this if you feel like graveyard strategies are just going crazy in your meta. Then I would definitely run maybe more Grafdigger Cages or something similar that shuts down graveyards. Up next, I have another one of Mana Leak to bring a total of 3. I would bring this against control decks or combo decks, or any deck where I can't deal with, for example, large creatures. So I'll bring this in to try and counter those large creatures. Those are the type of scenarios where I would bring in a Mana Leak. Again, this can be changed out for something else if you feel like you don't need any more permission. Next, we have Phyrexian Revoker. Again, whole creature toolbox idea. Instead of running Pithing Needle, I got a Phyrexian Revoker. You could traverse for it, which I've done many times, and you can go and shut down whatever planeswalker, artifact, or whatever you want to target. You can target with Phyrexian Revoker. So, cool little card, and yeah, works really well. Up next, Reclamation Sage. Here's again our artifact or enchantment destruction card that we can traverse for. Again, it comes in very handy if there's an Aether Vial we want to destroy, or a Chalice we want to. Well, I mean, if there's a Chalice we want to destroy, odds are we probably can't cast Traverse because Chalice is on 1. But assuming Chalice is on 2 or something, then you could go for a Reclamation Sage, or you can go for Reclamation Sage early on. Before Chalice is cast, so that you have an answer once it does get cast. So Reclamation Sage has many different applications, and you can tutor for it. So it's the main reason why it's a creature here. Up next, Scavenging Ooze. Again, I would bring this in against decks that rely on their graveyard, not necessarily just Dredge, because this deck is a bit soft to Dredge, but other decks that may want to abuse cards in their graveyard. Like Erosa or other types of control decks. So Scavenging Ooze is in there. And last but not least, Spell Pierce. Again, just part of the whole permission package. If I'm playing against Jund, for example, I'll bring in Spell Pierce to try and thwart off early planeswalkers. Combo decks, again, even control decks, for early on permission, Spell Pierce can be useful. Again, this is really up to you on what kind of permission package you want in this deck. I would definitely not remove permission from the 75. I mean, one of the main benefits of running blue is that you have access to permission, so I would recommend at least you have some permission somewhere. But, I run 1 Spell Pierce, 1 Mana Leak in the side. I feel like that's sufficient. And that is Temur Rogues. It's a fun little deck. I've had a lot of fun with it. I don't think it's going to win a Pro Tour. I would be shocked, but I would love to see it win a GP, but no one's really running it. It definitely has its weaknesses, so it's definitely not going to be good against all the top tier decks, but it is a surprise for your opponents. They're not sure what to target. There's a lot of creatures that we run. They're all mostly small. You don't know what to do. And your opponent might waste their time removing your Fairy Miscreants, your little il-kors, and all of a sudden you could go traverse for a Tarmogoyf for a Huntmaster, and all of a sudden they're out of removal. That's great. Our ability to run Magus of the Moon, or being able to tutor for a Blood Moon, essentially, through Magus of the Moon is powerful. We have cool interactions with Obsessive Skinner, boosting up our relatively weak creatures, and all of a sudden our weak creatures become big threats. So, yeah, it's definitely a fun deck to play. I love playing it, and I've had relatively good success with it. But again, it is what it is. I suppose there are better decks you could be playing in Temur colors, but if you want to do something like this, where you get to turn sideways and do cool things and draw a lot of cards, and be interactive. Which is why I love playing Temur, because you can be so interactive, then this is a fun little deck to try out. I have it foiled out too. So hopefully soon I'll share with you guys some photos and some videos of what those cards look like. I'd love to do that for all the cards. Once Paper Magic comes back online, with the whole pandemic stuff going on, I definitely plan on going to tournaments to start, having actual reports and writing big reports and big write-ups on tournament results and match results. So, yeah, that's the main reason why I've gone back and purchased all those cards again, to hopefully bring a lot more value to you guys down the line, especially once the website's up and running. So yeah, I mean, if you have any questions or suggestions for this deck, I'd love to hear them. Leave a comment down below on YouTube. If you enjoyed this deck tech, give it a thumbs up. I would appreciate it. If you enjoy my content in general, subscription really goes a long way. It shows me that you are interested and you want more, and it also helps the channel out as well. It helps others find my videos. So stay tuned for more. I got more ideas, more videos I want to put out there. Yeah, thanks, and have a good one.